Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining today. My name is Emily Best, and I'm a coordinator of the campaign for toxic-free food packaging hosted by Zero Waste Europe, and I'll be moderating today's webinar. This webinar is part of our ongoing Zero Waste Live semester. Our webinars happen once a month from October to June, and we cover topics around various waste-related issues. For those that don't know, our organization, Zero Waste Europe, is a Brussels-based NGO working on advocacy at the EU level to achieve a zero waste society, but also a network of organizations implementing zero waste strategies at national and local levels across Europe. Zero Waste Cities is the Zero Waste Europe program dedicated to help cities and communities transition towards zero waste. It brings together a European platform of knowledge for local stakeholders to implement best practices, as well as mentoring and recognition programs for municipalities. Today's webinar is about the presence of harmful chemicals and products that are impacting both our health and our environment. Consumers are exposed to many hazardous chemicals on a daily basis. The European Commission has committed in the Chemicals Strategy for Sustainability and the Circular Economy Action Plan to make sustainable products and packaging the norm. Addressing the presence of hazardous chemicals from the design phase is a requisite to achieving these objectives. As part of the effort to raise awareness of these issues among consumers, lawmakers, and other stakeholders, the coalition involved in the campaign for toxic-free food packaging is working to update the laws in the EU around food packaging and other food contact materials. We will soon launch a website to serve as the one-stop shop for resources on this important issue, with a library dedicated to studies, research, and infographics on food contact materials, as well as a news feed and ways to take action. The campaign also has a monthly newsletter called Food for Thought, in which we briefly review and analyze the top developments in this area. If you're interested in following the topic, you can post your email in the chat and I can help get you signed up, or I'll shortly post a link. This webinar will go into greater depth to answer the following questions. How does the presence of hazardous chemicals in products impact our health? How are zero waste solutions contributing to minimizing exposure to hazardous chemicals? And what can the EU do to ensure clean material streams achieve a toxic-free circular economy and protect consumers' health? Our speakers today are Dorota Napierska from Zero Waste Europe, Christiane Seidel from VZBV, or the Federation of German Consumer Organizations, and Florian Suter from the Food Packaging Forum. During the webinar today, each speaker will present for about 10 minutes. After every presentation, we'll then have 10 minutes for clarification questions. At the end of all of the presentations and question sessions, we'll have the final 30 minutes for a joint Q&A and discussion with the speakers. For the tools today, please use the chat box to introduce yourself if you would like, and please submit your questions via the Q&A tool, and I will use those to pass along to the speakers. We are also streaming on YouTube, so those joining via YouTube can submit the questions in the chat there. Without any further delays, let's start our webinar today with our first speaker. Dorota is the Policy Officer on Toxic-Free Consumption and Production at Zero Waste Europe. She is a toxicologist and holds a PhD in biomedical sciences. Prior to joining Zero Waste Europe, Dorota was leading the Safer Chemicals program at Healthcare Without Harm Europe and worked for the European Commission and at the Department of Public Health of Katholieke Universiteit Leuven. At Zero Waste Europe, Dorota's work focuses on the topic of non-toxicity of products and packaging, food contact materials in particular, and the clean and effective material cycles needed for achievement of a truly circular economy. Thank you, Dorota.
Thank you, Emily. I hope, and of course, good afternoon, everyone. And I hope you can see well my slides and you can hear me well. Otherwise, Emily, you have to shout to me. So once again, good afternoon. I'm truly happy to be able to talk on such an important topic today. And when the biggest challenge for me was actually to choose what to present during such a short time giving. But let's start by looking at the global situation. So the evidence is actually crystal clear that we are putting extreme pressures on the planet. And the United Nations Environmental Programme summarizes it as a triple planetary crisis. So in addition to the climate emergency, we are dealing with damaged nature and increasing pollution risks. At the beginning of this year, an excellent scientific paper concluded that the rapid growth of chemicals and plastic has exceeded a planetary boundary. It is estimated that currently there are more than 350,000 chemicals available worldwide, and predictions are that production and usage of chemicals will continue to rise sharply. Looking at Europe, the volume and diversity of chemicals produced and consumed also grew substantially over the past century and continues to increase. And with 1,100 chemicals currently on the market and around 23,000 being registered, majority of them are classified as hazardous to health. Unfortunately, well-characterized chemicals represent only the tip of the iceberg. And because for the majority, around 70,000 of substances, we know very little when it comes to their hazard and exposures. And this happens despite the fact that the EU has the most comprehensive and advanced chemical legislation in the world. Still, the quality of information on chemical risks reported by industry is often poor, with around 30% of dossiers found to be not compliant with information requirements. And the existing process for restricting hazardous chemicals requires a very high burden of proof. It takes years, sometimes even decades, and the framework simply puts too much pressure on the authorities, public agencies, and too little on manufacturers. The good news is that the problem, and more importantly, a need for improvement has been recognized by the EU. In 2020, the European Commission launched the Chemical Strategy for Sustainability, which foresees actions to better regulate chemicals to ensure protection both of human health and the environment. And one of the strategy's aims is to better protect citizens through banning the most harmful chemicals in consumer products, including in food contact materials, toys, cosmetics, furniture, textiles, just to name a few. To clarify, the most harmful chemicals are those who can be carcinogenic, mutagenic, toxic for reproduction, persistent, bioaccumulative, or can be the endocrine disrupting chemicals, which basically means that those chemicals are messing up with our hormones. Unfortunately, many substances with such characteristics are still present in daily consumer's product. And let's look just a bit more closely on food contact materials, which are literally everywhere in our daily life, because almost everything we eat and drink comes in contact with food contact materials. They can be made of, for example, metal, glass, paper, and of course, plastic. There are also thousands of chemicals in food contact materials that are potentially, well, they are present there. They can also migrate into our food and drink and eventually end up in our body. So in Europe alone, around 8,000 of chemicals can be used in food packaging and other food contact materials. The safety of food contact materials has frequently been questioned due to the presence of problematic chemicals, hazardous ones, such the most famous being phthalates, bisphenols, PFAS. More information can be found in a dedicated food contact chemicals database. Currently, more than 600 chemicals have been prioritized for further assessment and substitution. But equally worrying is that for many of those chemicals, we simply lack a safety assessment. And I just like to emphasize that problematic chemicals are not only found in plastics, but also in some single-use alternatives such as paper and cardboard packaging. Also, not exclusively single-use, but reusable items can show also release of the hazardous chemicals. So why we can measure the chemicals and their leaching in and from products, human biomonitoring provides a tool and information to help us understand the concentration of chemicals in human urine, blood, hair tissue, show also exposure over time. And why we actually should be concerned is because such biomonitoring is regularly finding dozens, even hundreds of chemicals in our bodies, including unborn children. Recently, also microplastic has been identified in human placenta and blood. And it is also crucial to know that certain groups are particularly sensitive to environmental stressors, including children, pregnant women, also the elderly, and those suffering from illnesses. In particular, exposure, even with really very small dose to certain hazardous chemicals during critical windows of development in fetuses and young children can lead to irreversible effects later in life, ranging from impacts on development, learning abilities, causing chronic diseases and cancer. And also importantly, in our daily life, we are exposed not to one single chemical at a time, but to a complex mixture of chemicals. And there are still gaps in our understanding of the risk posed by the situation. That was quite a notice publication by WHO. So World Health Organization in 2012. This report made clear that exposure to endocrine disrupting chemicals during fetal development and puberty plays a role in the increased incidences of reproductive, immune, cardiopulmonary, and nervous system diseases. So we know the global rates of endocrine-related cancers, as well as obesity and type 2 diabetes have been increasing over the past 40 and 50 years. And the speed with this has occurred rules out the genetic factors as the sole plausible explanation. So chemicals actually are recognized as the guilty ones. Also very disturbing scientific evidence showing that exposure to certain chemicals can harm also future, so even not unexposed generation, which means our children and grandchildren. In Europe, exposure to chemicals is linked to the top 10 diseases, including cancers, cardiovascular diseases, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, diabetes, kidney disease, and asthma. And the data linking exposures to chemicals, including endocrine disrupting chemicals and human diseases are much stronger now than a decade ago when, for example, the report of WHO has been published. So epidemiologists showed recently how chemicals are endangering human fertility. Recent studies from Denmark reported a link between prenatal exposure to PFAS and increased risk of children being hospitalized for infectious diseases. And quite shocking, in fact, is the publication showing a strong association between COVID-19 disease outcome and one of the PFAS substances, as hospitalized individuals with PFBA exposure were more than 5 times more likely to progress to intensive care and death. Well, in the EU, exposure to phthalates, a group of chemicals, very known chemicals used as plasticizers that can be frequently found still in food packaging, has been associated with negative impact on both female and male reproductive system. So we are at the point that scientists working on endocrinology, epidemiology, toxicology, environmental and public health reached a consensus that harmful chemicals present in products, including food content materials, are putting our health at risks. And scientists also agree that while more solutions are being developed towards circularity and recycling, the critical aspect of chemical safety is unfortunately still well, ignored or overlooked, let's say. We see that using recycled packaging waste to create new packaging often increases the number and level of problematic chemicals, and it is due to contaminants present in the original product, degradation of the material during recycling, accumulation of chemicals when materials are repeatedly recycled, and finally, when non-food grade materials are entering the recycling system of full contact waste stream. So quite large body of evidence already exists showing that hazardous substances in recycled plastic raises concern about its safety and quality and proves that those chemicals hamper the circular economy. And for example, very recently published systemic review on the PET beverage bottles, those are actually the most popular plastic bottles on the market, concludes that recycling can concentrate or introduce new chemicals to the materials. And one of the most popular one of the chemical detected to migrate at a higher level from recycled PET compared to the virgin PET bottle was actually bisphenol A. So one of the best studied and very harmful human endocrine disruptor. We are aware that current efforts to establish a circular economy to reduce the environmental impact of production and consumption, so recycling, basically the process of recycling may generate new risks in terms of chemical exposure via consumer products. And mentioned before already, the EU chemical strategy also made it very clear that in a clean circular economy, it is essential to boost the production and uptake of secondary raw materials, but we have to ensure that both primary and secondary materials and products are always safe. Well, without doubt, only by tackling actually the source of the problem, so that means eliminating toxic chemicals in the virgin materials and articles, we can really succeed in achieving truly safe and sustainable products, including food contact materials, food packaging, and also the widespread use of recycled materials. So that's my last slide. A couple of key messages from I just what said. Europeans are exposed to hazardous chemicals due to their presence and migration from a wide range of products, and food contact materials and food packaging being a significant route. Recycling can concentrate or introduce new chemicals to the materials. Children and pregnant women are more sensitive to the adverse effects of chemicals. And in Europe, exposure to hazardous chemicals is associated with a number of chronic diseases. And I haven't touched really on this in my presentation, but wanted to mention that also consumers, businesses, not only the authorities and regulators, have a role in scaling up more safe and sustainable solutions. For example, by making better choices. So we'll hear about this from the next speaker. And with this, I would like to thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Dorota. We did get a few questions. The first one, which perhaps you can answer, if not, we can save it towards the end. Why is BPA still allowed at the EU level in cans if everyone is informed?
Simply because the current regulation is still allowing to use it. Those who are a little bit following the regulatory developments know that actually the food contact legislation is like 45 years old now, and from the last year, the European Commission started the review process. Unfortunately, this process is a little bit delayed, so we expect really the proposal of the new legislation somewhere in the middle of the next year. But the regulation as such, as it's still valid, is actually still allowing those substances. So like BPA, which is definitely also assessed and recognized in the EU as substance of very high concern. So due to these rules, actually it can be used. But only actually recently also the regulation is working like this, that actually it's not really still. We hope it will be in the future. The chemicals like this will be simply eliminated from the products because of their intrinsic hazards. But at the moment, we are still having, these regulations. We are assessing, they are allowing the substances to be used through giving and recommending so-called safe level. But again, those who are following a bit on the regulatory developments know that EFSA, so this European Food Safety Agency, that is responsible basically to giving this, recommendations for the food contact materials, recently in December actually recommended to lower the safe dose from 4 micrograms of the BPA of the kilogram of human body per day to 4 nanograms, which means 100,000 lower. So it's actually it's recognized really that basically means that the substance has to be removed. But yeah, that's also a bit of showing a sad story how the regulation is really slow, and we talk about BPA since decades, and it's still there and it's still legally present. So that's definitely must improve in the future.
Thank you. Great, we've got a couple more questions. Andrea says, banning these chemicals will probably take a while, unfortunately. Until that happens, hopefully as soon as possible, what actions can be taken now to ensure that infants and young children in particular are protected?
That's a very good question. So, yeah, I think it's very often, and I'm sure that also Christian will mention this, that consumers sometimes actually are not really aware actually what can be in the products, and this is the basic problems. So those who are aware, for example, that some chemicals can be more present, mostly more in plastic, they try to avoid plastic per se. So simply by or using less packaging, or simply maybe not really of using only the bottles from the stainless steel of glass. So people who really want to know, they could find kind of really good tips how to at least reduce those exposure. But we basically cannot be really always sure that's true. Well, there are also, I think there are also some initiatives, and that's what I mentioned in the last point of my presentation. So the consumers can make the choices. So I didn't have time, but there are some alternatives, and definitely we know that the more inert, materials like glass still are more inert, are more safe. So that's first point. But also, the businesses, we know that there are also businesses who are actually not really waiting for the regulations to come. They also are progressive, and they also can choose certain products to be used in their, in their business. And that Florian will actually also talk about it later on. So there are some definitely there is possibility, and but I think it's also not fair to leave it to consumer only, that they have to make these choices and make this constantly worries if they are making the right choices. That's something. That's why we really need very strong and straightforward regulation also in Europe.
Excellent. I'm going to take one more question from the Q&A for Dorota, and then we will move on to Christian. This last question is from Sorsha. With a policy push towards recycled content, how can recycled content be incorporated safely? Secondly, is chemical recycling seen as an industry solution by stripping it back?
There are two big questions. Well, just first one, well, yes, recycling, of course, as shown, it's showing is the problem. Actually, we only regulate so far regulate in the EU the recycling of plastic. Other materials are still not included. That's another gap to be filled. But we also know that plastic as also shown, that it's producing a plastic, and also the finishing the materials, the articles, requires simply use of many different chemicals, just to provide the certain look, the certain functionality of the final product. And there is a problem, but there are different what we always will say first, if you will remove those problematic chemicals from the virgin product, it kind of makes logical that when you start recycling, you will have less problem at this point. But the recycling technology itself can also introduce some kind of contaminants, because that is quite complicated process. And for example, in this publication that I just mentioned about, the problems that have been also seen with recycling of PET bottle, there is a clear kind of recommendation that, for example, if you have more like a closed loop recycling, so if you better control your product in the closed loop, when you produce it, when you take it off from the consumer, so that's allows to better control. And there also exists like this kind of like a super clean, recycling technology. So it's always, there are probably more expensive, more, so it needs more investment, but they exist. And there is clear difference in the output from such a technology. On recycling, on the chemical recycling, yeah, I mean, I cannot really now give the really very, let's say, the point answer, because our actually main point of many of I think all the non-profit organizations and also other stakeholders is that there is actually very little information about performance of those technologies. So I can only recommend, maybe I will put it in the chat in a minute. There is the report published by ECHA, so European Chemicals Agency. It was published I think in October last year, or September, and actually entirely about chemical recycling. And there is a lot of conclusions. And one of the conclusions, for example, is that we don't know how efficient these technologies actually are, for example, in removing contaminants and hazardous chemicals. And there is also a lot of other questions still not answered. So that's the current state of the knowledge. We cannot really give a lot of information because we don't have it. And I don't know if this is because industry has this information not sharing with us, or if it just also is still looking for the answers, probably. But yeah, it's a lot of open questions there. So it's rather technology that still needs to prove that it's working. Let's say it's my opinion, at least.
Excellent. Thank you for that overview. And it is a difficult. I apologize. My son is home today. We're going to move on to, hold on.
I think we can move to the second presentation, if I may jump in. So, Kristen, yes, please.
I'm just going to have a go.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'm just going to continue right away. Yeah, thank you, Dorota, for your very interesting presentation. And I'm a bit tempted to answer all those questions that just have been raised at the moment, but I'm going to start with my presentation first. Here we go. Just a moment. There we go. Hope you can see it now. First of all, we're a federation of German consumer organizations. If you don't know us, so we are funded by the government, and we are part of a members network. So we have the consumer advice centers in the German federal states, in the Bundesländer, which provide us advice to consumers. So consumers can go there, can ask the questions, and then we're going to help them, give them tips, hints, how they can protect themselves in different areas. Food is just one of those topics that we work on. And we also provide advice to decision makers. So when it comes to consumer policies, we try to help them to take better decisions to protect consumers. And food contact materials is, of course, one of the issues that we are working on, because we see that our consumer advice centers receive a lot of questions from consumers. So they come to the consumer advice centers with all kind of questions, and often these are about materials and substances that have been a lot in the media, such as bisphenol A. So that's something that we saw in the last years. And we ask ourselves, what do consumers actually know about food contact materials? How do they perceive the food contact materials? And we conducted a representative study in 2019, which you can see here. And 2019, it's an online representative study and included over 1,000 participants. And we saw that for a majority of participants, food packaging and labeling is pretty important. And at the same time, a lot of people felt poorly informed about the safety of food packaging. And then we also asked them, we tried to dig a bit deeper, and we showed them the glass and fork symbol. And we saw that only a few people knew the meaning, just under half of respondents knew the meaning of the glass and fork symbol. And and here we gave them the answers, so we don't know if they really knew the meaning or if they just had a lucky guess. And almost a third of respondents think that the glass and fork symbol means dishwasher safe, which of course is not the case. And those findings, they could be considered a bit contradictory. So if you care about something, you want to have information, you want to look out for more information. And so we ask ourselves, so why it's important to consumers, why don't they have the information? Why don't they know what a symbol is about? So we try to dig a bit deeper and try to understand better what consumers think about food contact materials, what do they know and how do they use them? And therefore we conducted a qualitative research exercise. So last year, it's focus group discussions. We had 4 focus group discussions in 4 German cities, in Berlin, Leipzig, Hamburg, and Mannheim. And we tried to ask them the same questions again, but this time in focus groups. So they had a discussion. And again, we wanted to know, what do consumers know about the safety of food contact materials? How do they perceive potential health risks? And how do they integrate this knowledge in their daily lives? And this is not a qualitative, it is not a representative sample. It is as close as it is as close as possible to a representative sample. But since it's a qualitative research exercise, so including 30 consumers only, cannot be considered a representative sample, just as a small disclaimer. And when we asked our participants about food contact materials, spontaneously, they came up with sustainability aspects. So they mentioned recyclability, waste management, waste reduction, but none of them spontaneously came up with safety aspects. And this shows that safety of food contact materials is not necessarily part of their daily considerations or their daily knowledge. It doesn't mean that they don't think about the safety or that safety is not important to them, but it's not very present to them, not as present as sustainability considerations. It might be because it's not that much in the media, it's not that much talked about by politicians, can have different reasons, but it's not as present and can be described as a reduced awareness. And this reduced awareness can be is linked to the complexity of the issues at the same time. So, unlike food poisoning, the safety of food contact materials, the exposure to different chemicals, is not really linked to the participants to a disease. So for the food poisoning, you have a direct consequence. If you eat bad meat, if you eat bad food, you will get ill. With food to contact materials, it's a bit difficult. It's different because here it works in the long term. So it's a long-term exposure that counts. And therefore, there is no direct or apparent link for our participants between the exposure and the disease. And often participants mentioned that they don't have an alternative. So if they go to the supermarket or if they order takeaway food, they buy the food product. They don't buy the packaging, and often they can't choose between different packaging alternatives. So if you want to buy sliced cheese or a burger or something, it comes in a specific food packaging. And even if you want to go for a different material, often you don't have a choice because you want to buy the food. And on top of that, the assessment of risks linked to chemicals is very complex. So here we talk about very difficult concepts and considerations, such as low dose effects and so on. And unless you don't have a degree in chemistry, it's very difficult to understand for consumers and also for our participants what has been carried on, where are the, how is risk assessment conducted? It's very difficult for them. And on top of that, food packaging or safety of food in general is linked to a lot of difficult and different decisions. So often our participants mentioned that they want to eat healthy, they want to eat sustainable, they want to support local farmers, and eating healthy is just another factor linked to all those other considerations. And making everything right seems sometimes like squaring the circles. You can't do it. And even if participants wanted to have more information about a specific substance or product, they weren't sure where to look for this kind of information. For them, it was very difficult to find reliable and at the same time also understandable information. And this makes it very complex for our participants to really assess the risks and to integrate the safety of food contact materials or considerations of the safety of food contact materials into their daily lives. And because of all those factors, our participants, they kind of felt overwhelmed by the complexity. They felt that they can't assure the safety of food contact materials themselves. And they therefore relied on public authorities to step in and make sure for them that food contact materials are safe and don't contain any dangerous substances. And we also saw that a lot of participants tried to downsize the importance of this issue. We often heard the sentence, well, if I use this packaging or this material, it might not be good for me at the moment, but it won't kill me. So they try to reduce the impact of dangerous chemicals on their body, even though they're aware that they might have a difficult or dangerous impact on their bodies. And also another factor, which I found very interesting, is that they use food contact materials and packaging based on routines and learned behavior rather than actual facts and evidence. So they told us, like, we have been using this packaging for ages. Even my grandma has used it for ages and it didn't kill her. And these kind of sentences. And also they relied on their senses. So when they saw that a packaging got out of shape after they put it in a microwave, or that it affected the taste or smell of food, they wouldn't use it anymore. But they couldn't really explain what has happened here. They just smelled and tasted that there were some things going on that they couldn't explain, and therefore they stopped using those products. But they couldn't explain what has happened. And in the next step, we have showed our participants the symbols and warnings used on food contact materials. So, and here we have built on the first survey that I have mentioned earlier that we did in 2019. And it was confirmed that participants don't know or not aware of symbols and warning used on food packaging materials. So none of the participants could mention spontaneously or has remembered having seen such a symbol like the glass and fork symbol or the dishwasher safe symbol on food packaging. They were looking at the bottles. So when we asked them about materials that were used, they were all looking on plastic bottles in front of them and were searching for codes or symbols. Some of them pointed at the deposit system symbol that we have in Germany and came up with different explanations, but none has answered to having seen this glass and fork symbol before. And this is pretty worrying. And because they don't know the symbol, or none of those symbols, they don't trust them. So they weren't sure who issues those symbols and who makes sure that they are not misused. And therefore, those symbols don't influence the purchasing decision of the participants. So they told us, or most of them told us, that even if they saw a product in a supermarket that has the symbol or hasn't the symbol, they still would use it and buy it because, yeah, well, they don't trust it. They told us like everybody can come up with a symbol and just put it on whatever packaging they like to. And therefore, in consequence, those symbols and warnings are currently of little use to consumers. And then in the next step, we ask our participants how they would design such a symbol or warning information. And they came up with a lot of different ideas, and I have listed some of them here. So they all agreed that warning information needs to be mandatory, so it has to be on the product if it contains dangerous substances or can release dangerous substances. It has to be legible. That means that the font size needs to be big enough. It has to be on the packaging and permanently on the product. So even if you use it for several years and you don't keep the packaging, that you still see it on the product itself. It needs to be understandable and unambiguous. It's pretty clear. They prefer symbols rather than text. And if there was a text, or if a text is necessary, it has to be short, so only a few groups of words. And what I found pretty interesting, they came up with the idea of a harmonious system of symbols and mentioned the example of washing symbols that you have on your clothes or textiles, so that everyone, I think you all know what I mean, everybody knows the symbols, and yeah, if you don't know the symbol, you can easily look them up online and you will always come up with the same explanation for those symbols. And they also suggested that the explanations of those symbols can be printed on kitchen appliances, such as a dishwasher or a microwave, so that you can check your kitchen appliance for a legend or an explanation of the symbols before you put your Tupperware or your bottle in your dishwasher, for example. They also suggested that the symbols need to be colored. And a last point, which was discussed a lot, were the QR codes. So some participants said that QR codes might provide additional information, but all of our participants agreed that they wouldn't use it in practice. So for them, it's just too burdensome. If you do your grocery shopping, they wouldn't get out their phone, scan the QR code, and read all the information online. So it's nice to have for them, but none of the participants felt that this is an appropriate solution. And then, so what did we learn from this exercise? Well, generally participants assume that substances and products were tested and checked by an authority and by a public authority before being placed on the market. So consumers believe that when a specific risks or when a risk assessment is conducted, most sensitive consumers, such as pregnant women or children, were considered as the baseline. So the food contact materials need to be safe for these sensitive consumers as well as for any other consumers. And they also assume that all food contact materials are safe for these consumers, plastic as well as glass, ceramics, and so on. And they also assume that risk assessment is conducted by a public authority and not by companies themselves or other third parties. And when it comes to risk management, our participants assume that when products are not safe, they will be prevented from entering the market. This includes imports. And lastly, and I think this is very important, they all agreed that they can only, or consumers can only use food contact materials safely if the right information is easily accessible to them. So which means if they don't have the information, or if they can't understand the information, they can't protect themselves. And what does that mean from a policy perspective? I think we can all agree that the revision of the food contact framework regulation on food contact materials needs to be finalized as soon as possible. And this should include a clear ban on particularly harmful substances. And Dorota just has mentioned all of them. And I think we also need a strict European approval and registration process. And this should include a positive list for chemicals that makes clear to authorities as well as to companies which chemicals and materials may be used in which product area. And lastly, we need to help consumers to use food contact materials safely. So when products are designed, their hazards need to be considered for normal and foreseeable conditions of use. So if a company sells a coffee mug or a spatula, it has to be safe to use even at higher temperatures. We also need to have a standardized, comprehensive, and important binding communication and labeling scheme for food contact materials. And I've just mentioned a few ideas how this could look like. And I think what also became pretty clear that warning information and symbols need to be of actual use for consumers. At the moment, this is not the case. And lastly, we need to strengthen the monitoring and enforcement system. And public authorities need to have the capacity, information, and knowledge. This is also important, the knowledge to make sure that food contact materials are safe. And this should also include import controls. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Christiane. We do have some folks interested in reviewing your studies. Where could they find them?
They're published online. So we presented them last week and I can post the link in the chat. They're also available in English and German.
Okay, great, thank you. And then I'm gonna take a couple of these questions that are in the Q&A. So there's a little bit of a discussion going on about packaging, with harmful chemicals, and that often the packaging used in Europe comes from third countries. So what are your thoughts on that in terms of what the Commission should be doing to, protect EU consumers?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we saw that the participants in our study, they paid attention to whether the packaging or the products came from an EU country or Germany or a third country. And especially China was mentioned a lot as the, not so reliable country of origin for those food contact materials. And they said that they wouldn't necessarily buy a packaging if they saw the made in China symbol. But at the same time, as I said, often you can't choose between packaging. I mean, you can choose if you buy this plastic bottle or a plastic container or not, but often packaged food or food comes in packaging. So if you buy a sliced cheese, as I just mentioned, or sausages or milk, it comes in a packaging. And there you don't know if the packaging comes from Germany, from Belgium, or from China. And therefore, all materials need to be safe for use, no matter whether they come from Germany or China or other third countries. And therefore, we need to have reliable rules for all countries, for all materials. And of course, we need to step up the enforcement. And this also includes import controls. And at the moment, we see that, import controls don't really work very well. This is not just a matter of food contact materials. It's for all other food products, the same case. And it's also for the enforcement. We see that the authorities, at least in Germany, they can't really handle the market and they need more staff, they need more equipment, they need the specialized knowledge to make sure that unsafe products are not able to enter the market. And if they enter the market, they need to be retraced as soon as possible. So this is a general problem.
Thank you. And then I think just one more question and we'll go on to Florian. In your opinion, and I think we can ask this at the end as well, what would be the main regulatory loophole that should be fixed in the upcoming food contact material regulation revision?
Well, it's a difficult question to answer because there's so many loopholes. I think what we need to have is, as I mentioned, something like a positive list. So we need to have clear rules for all materials and all substances across Europe, because at the moment it's a patchwork of different rules. Germany has their rules, Belgium has other rules. Sometimes they overlap, sometimes they don't, and that makes it very difficult for the enforcement to see in the end what is safe and what is not safe. And therefore, we need to have clear and binding rules for all materials to make sure that the end product is safe.
Thank you so much, Christiane. That was a really interesting presentation. So we are now going to move on to hear from our third and final speaker, Florian Suter. He is the Scientific Officer and Scorecard Lead at the Food Packaging Forum. Florian completed his studies in environmental science with a major in atmosphere and climate. He earned a PhD from ETH Zurich, focusing on life cycle assessment. In particular, he investigated the potential benefits and challenges of cascading and substitution effects. He then went to work as a prevention and environment expert at the Swiss Cancer League. Among others, he was responsible there for the strategic development of a framework with programs related to the environment and human health interface, as well as for the analysis and communication of environmental risk factors for cancer. And he will tell us more about the UP scorecard.
Thank you very much for this introduction. So yes, as you said, I will make an introduction, a brief introduction into the Understanding Packaging Scorecard, or in short, UP scorecard. So that's a tool where you can assess sustainability aspects of foodware and food packaging, and that should provide this information as simple as possible. So probably I'd like to start with what we would like to achieve with this UP scorecard. So we would like to foster safe and sustainability food packaging by enabling intuitive science-based packaging decision procurement and beyond. So I think we already heard that, of course, on the one hand, information is sometimes missing, and also information how bringing things together to get to a good decision, and we would like to go in this direction. So probably what is our kind of theory of change behind that? So we mainly focus on the food service industry because we think that food service industry has a huge purchasing power, and it could provide a transformative market signal when they would switch from one foodware food packaging to another one. And of course, this would potentially reduce high environmental burdens and health risks, things we already heard before. So that's kind of the potential we see. But of course, there is a challenge with that, because often there is a lack of technical expertise and or time to evaluate all these different foodware and food packaging options. On the one hand, there are a lot of different foodware and food packaging options available nowadays. On the other hand, of course, there are a lot of different claims, product claims, and it's not that easy to find out what it means exactly and which one you can trust or which one are probably less trustworthy. And that's why, as one solution, we provide the UP scorecard. And this is kind of an intuitive science-based packaging decision tool, as I said, for procurement, but also, of course, for all the other interested people, policymakers, and so on. How does it work? The UP scorecard assesses commonly used foodware and food packaging products. So of course, not all foodware and food packagings are included, but the most important ones. And it does kind of a comprehensive, coherent, and science-based assessment of this foodware and food packagings. And the idea is to provide then this information, which packaging options are good or the best from an environmental and a health perspective for a specific use case you have. So as it was mentioned, I'm working for the Food Packaging Forum, but the UP scorecard is much bigger because the UP scorecard is a multi-stakeholder group initiative with a lot of different stakeholders from global food service companies, NGOs, and technical experts. Some of them you see down here. And I think that's one of the really important things with the UP scorecard, that many different stakeholders are involved, and many different stakeholders, of course, are also interested in this kind of tool. So I don't know how many of you already used the UP scorecard or already had a look on it. So that's why here is a screenshot of the result page, just to show a little bit how it looks like. So that's the actual scorecard. What you can see here is we have, for example, here a use case, which is beverage containers. And then you can see here on the left the different generic foodware, food packaging options that are provided within the tool. For example, here now from stainless steel bottles to HDPE bottles. And in each use case, you have at least one reusable options. These are the ones that are marked in color here. And now the assessment is made with 6 different metrics you see here. For example, plastic pollution, climate, or recoverability. And you also get a summary score in the end. The numbers, they show the actual assessment, and the color code here shows how a specific product is performing compared to all the other products in this use case. So green plus, for example, means it performs on the best, and on the other hand, on the other side, you have, for example, the red cross. For the chemicals of concern score, you have also the hashed circles that says that you have to take attention a little bit because there is not, let's say, enough sufficient information to really say it is like this or that. That's kind of a sign to say, well, there is missing information. It's really important to get more information here. It's also important to say that the UP Scorecard is still in a beta version. There's a second beta version out now, but we're still working on many things, and we're also very interested in user feedback. Probably with this, I would like to focus a little bit on the 6 different metrics that are provided. So we have 3 quantitative metrics. They are LCA based, so life cycle assessment based, and we have 3 qualitative metrics. These are more like scales or ratings. So probably first the quantitative metrics. We have here climate impact, water use, and plastic pollution. Most, of course, know climate impact because I think most of the tools also in the field of foodware and food packaging provide climate impact as one metric. Water use says how much water is used during the life cycle of the product, and plastic pollution says something about how much plastic is leaked during the product life cycle. On the other hand, we have 3 qualitative metrics. One is the novel chemical of concern score that says something about the possible presence of chemicals of concern and the level of material inertness. I will say some more words about this on the next slide. We also have the recoverability. Recoverability says something about how big the potential is that a product can be recovered for commercial use or converted into beneficial materials. And then we have the sustainable sourcing, and this is saying something about the percentage of post-consumer recycled content that is used to produce a certain product. Now with a focus on the chemical of concern score, this COC score that should be a starting point to raise awareness. As I mentioned before, with the overview of the result page, it's really difficult to get information or data here, not only for us, but I think for all people that are involved, also for procurement officers. And that's why it's a starting point to really start this discussion and to give more insights on where more data is needed. The chemicals of concern score in the UP Scorecard is a sum of 2 subscores. One subscore is the COC present score, chemicals of concern present score, and that says something about the present. So are there intentionally added chemicals of concern present, or is it likely that they're present in the product, and how reliable is this information? So it's then, for example, the question, is it just you, for example, the producer saying these chemicals of concern are not in my product, or is it a third-party proved thing that someone says they're not involved? And of course, if it's third-party proved, you get a better score than when only you saying, well, they're not involved. And this chemicals of concern present score that is based on a list for known food contact chemicals of concern, so-called food chemicals of concern list that prioritizes and group the different chemicals of concern into 3 tiers. And if you just avoid the products or the chemicals in the first tier, you already get a better score than when you have no knowledge about if there are any chemicals of concern involved. Of course, if you have all the chemicals of concern avoided in all the 3 tiers, you get an even better score. So that's one side of the chemicals of concern score, the overall one, and the other one is the inertness score. That says something about the inertness of the food contact material, and this is used as a proxy to say how likely is it that chemicals of concern will migrate from the packaging into the food. This is based on expert judgment, and for many food contact materials, there was not a clear consensus if now a product or material is inert or not. It's only for few, for example, glass, it's of course, we said, well, that's very inert. And for example, other ones like paper and board, they are not really inert. So what would we like to achieve with this chemicals of concern score? We would like to increase the transparency along the supply chain. We would like to provide kind of a pathway how safer chemistry materials could be installed in knowing better or more about the chemicals of concern within a product. We would also like to ensure that hazardous substances are limited or eliminated, and also, as also mentioned in the other presentation, to close information gaps, because often it's not even known that chemicals of concern can be included, or if there is the knowledge around, often it's not clear what kind of chemicals of concern are involved in a product. And of course, we also want to amplify sustainable product innovations. And I think it's also important for the UP Scorecard to show, of course, there are many important environmental impacts that happen also from foodware and food packaging, but also, of course, there are health-related impacts like the chemicals of concern that should be taken into consideration when deciding what kind of products should be used or should not be used. I more or less skipped this slide because Dorota made already a very nice introduction into chemicals of concern. That should just show chemicals of concern are substances that have one or more hazardous properties like the ones listed here. And that's also the definition that is used in the UP Scorecard. Of course, it's now a new tool that is out, and it's always the question, well, that's nice, but why should it be used, or why should it be used instead of other tools? And I think there are some points that make the UP Scorecard unique, or there are very important points to let people really use it or make it used broadly. One is the full transparency. For example, the methodology and the data behind the UP Scorecard is transparent. You can go to the website and click on different links, and then you see a lot of information about that. It's a science-based methodology. It's not just one saying, well, this one is better than the other one. There is a free and easy access. So it's an online tool. The independent and broad-based community engagement of the single-use material decelerator, the group behind the tool I already mentioned. And we try to consider a wide variety of sustainability impacts. So not only one or two, but many different sustainability impacts on the environmental side, but also on the health side. With that, I would like to come to my last slide. Of course, we work a lot on the further development and maintenance of the current beta version and on further upgrades. And there are already a lot of ideas how we could improve further on. There's also a lot of feedback. Currently, we mainly work on regionalization. The data that is used currently is US average based because the project started in the US, and currently we work on the implementation of a regionalization framework, first of all with data from Europe. And we also like to include more customization options so that you, beside the generic average numbers that are included, that you can switch, for example, the recycled content and so on. That's already possible now. And of course, many other ideas like different languages, more product container types, certain amount of personalization so that you probably can assess also your own products and so on. And as I said, if there are ideas how the tool could be improved better or more, we are very interested in that. With this, I would like to thank you for your attention, and more information you find on the website. If you have any questions, follow-ups, you can also use our email address. And of course, I'm very open for questions and discussion. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much, Florian. I think that's such a great tool to be available. I'm looking, does anyone have any questions for Florian? I'm not seeing any in particular, but we could open to a general discussion, and perhaps we did get a question, and Florian, maybe you want to start with it. If not, we can throw it to one of the other panelists about, Alexandra said, in a recent article, I've read that we consume a great deal of microplastic in beverage products, PET bottles, for example, to name one of the most used packaging materials. If that's accurate, why are plastic bottles not banned to consumers? And I do see Dorota is typing an answer, so we can get the panel involved in this.
Okay.
Do you want me to answer then, or just should I?
Sure, if you want to take it, sure.
Well, I think the answer simply is quite simple, because due to the existing regulation, we really need proof of, toxicity, of harm of any chemical. And microplastic is not even per se chemical. Microplastic means dozens of different chemicals in this rather physical form, like also nanoparticles. Yeah? It's a chemical structure, but it's also physical form. It's like can be more shape, different shapes, etc. So, well, unfortunately, we have more and more evidence about the presence of microplastic in everywhere environment and also in human body. I think we all have heard recently this study showing particles in our blood, but also last year was actually showing that these particles are effectively actually reaching the human placenta. Again, it's very worrying, because that means that this exposure, again, very, very closely or exposure to the unborn children. So, well, as long as probably we don't have very hard evidence, there will be no really much movement from the authorities, regulatory bodies. Well, we know that the European Union is actually recognizing the issue. There is open consultation about how we can minimize those unintentional release of microplastic. There's already a regulation that is going to come soon, I think, that will regulate intentionally added microplastic. But we need probably more data. So what I can actually also, maybe I will put it I will paste it in the chat, because, well, so there is the problem of the issue of missing information is again recognized. And actually last year, there is a big consortium which consists of 5 different consortia. So 5 really big pan-European projects that are all exclusively focusing on micro and nanoplastic. So I think that this only started last year, and if I'm not wrong, it will take 4 or 5 years before they will be completed. I will just, as I said, paste it in the link. So if you click on this link, there is the information about all those projects. So actually, there is European Union just invested, I think, 25 million to to look for. So it's a lot of good research is actually on the way, but it will take a while. It will take a while. So I don't think for the rest. It's also maybe some of you noticed that even in the released last week, there was a strategy on sustainable textiles. This also actually is specifically noticed that it will also tackle the problem of microplastic, because we know that actually in the environment, the most microplastic is coming from tires and from textiles. So yeah, that's. I don't think that nobody will ever ban the plastic bottle just before, because we know now that it's there are some microplastic released. Maybe in the future, but that's definitely not that will not happen now.
Thank you. Florian, I think we did get a question for you about the practical, what will be the practical implementation of the UP scorecard? If you could speak on that.
Yes, of course. So as I briefly mentioned, we would like to help people, and especially procurement officers, sustainability officers in the food service industry, to get better knowledge on the one hand on the different food packaging options, and also to give them kind of decision-making help to do that. When it comes to the tool itself, as I said, currently it's in the beta version still, so we would like to, by the end of the year, probably get to an alpha version, and then not only kind of passively say, well, there is a tool, please use it, that would be nice, but we would like to really get actively involved in establishing the tool to be used by procurement, probably also policymakers, and in the end also kind of institute the tool as a benchmark, especially on questions of sustainable assessment of foodware and food packaging.
Great, thank you. And then I was thinking, since Christiane got to answer the question about her view on the main regulatory loophole in terms of the FDM revision, maybe Florian, you could take that, and then we could go to Dorota's what she thinks as well, that, you know, sort of the number one thing that we need to do.
Yeah, I think as already answered before from others, I think there is more than one problem. I think it's also a bit the question where you focus on, of course. It's not always in every region the same. I think one very big thing when it comes, for example, to chemicals of concern, but I think also for other impacts is, of course, to really force well, the people using it or producing it to kind of know what's in their product, or to start this process, this discussion, because I think that's one big thing that we like to start with the UP scorecard, and of course also all the others I think here in the field, because I think that's one of the biggest challenges, because even if you would like to know what's in your product, often it's just nearly impossible to find out.
Dorota, did you want to say anything on that point?
Which is, well, it's okay. So we'll talk as toxicologists and from the perspective of the chemical perspective. I think that's I really hope that will be this in future. There will be also this generic approach to risk will be to risk assessment will be applied. So basically, but you know, just the chemicals that we know that have, you know, they're highly hazardous, they are simply eliminated without discussion, you know, about which dose is safe, which not is safe, you know, what is the exposure, is there exposure, because that's now it's leading to years of discussions, research, and, you know, changing the reference value. So that's important. And actually what we still miss, but I know that there's also on the way, is this one substance, one assessment. So if you have the REACH system, if you have this big regulation and it's classifying the chemical as reprotoxic, that should be automatically applied to all the legislation. So it's not like now that it's removed from toys, but it can be used, for example, still in food contact materials. I mean, if something is substance is toxic, you just have to remove automatically from all, you know, from all consumer products. That's my view. I think it's the most efficient, because it's like, if we see in the history of you know, our consumption regulation, it's always comes to the point that we are acting a bit too late and too little. Although we have the evidence out there quite early, it takes really years and decades before actually we effectively are removing hazardous chemicals. So and that's hopefully it will change. There are some kind of commitments made by the authorities.
And then I think we just have one last question about the symbols discussed in Christiane's presentation. And I know for myself, I don't always know what all those symbols mean. I think sometimes they are a little bit unclear. It's hard to know exactly, does this mean I can put it in the microwave or that I shouldn't put it in the microwave? And the question is, why do we need so many of them that maybe don't get enough consumer education? Why isn't there a more simple system? How can we make it easier for people to know what to do? But I mean, at the same time, we shouldn't put all of this on the consumer. How can we move forward and make things better, for the environment, for our health, for the consumer, for the supplier? If there's any final words on that, I think that would be great. Then we'll wrap it up.
Yeah, I definitely agree. And I think that's a very important point. The responsibility for the safety of food products shouldn't be with the consumers, and it shouldn't be up to consumers to start a field research or studying all those symbols, warnings that we have currently on the product packaging, because we already have a lot of other symbols of food. When it comes to allergy, we have the Nutri-Score, we have the Planet Score in several European countries, and we shouldn't add another symbol that consumers don't understand. So as the baseline should be that we need to have strict and binding rules across Europe. And for food products or food contact materials in general should only be able to enter the market or should only be able to put on the market if they are safe, full stop. And it shouldn't be with consumers to study the safety of food contact materials. We need to have safe end products. But nevertheless, it might be necessary to have some warning information. For example, when you shouldn't put, or when you have an ice cream container, a lot of people put hot soup in the ice cream container and then store it in the fridge or something. And here it might make sense to add a small logo or symbol. Don't put hot soup in your ice cream container because it is not made for storing hot substances. This is just an example. And here a logo or a symbol would make sense to consumers to see like, okay, it's an ice cream container, no hot soup in here. But as the baseline, food contact materials need to be safe, and it shouldn't be up to consumers to study all the symbols and warnings that we have on them. They need to be safe.
Okay, great. Thank you so much to our speakers today. I think we're going to wrap it up. So please check out our tools section being pasted in the chat, where you'll find all the presentations of today's speakers and many more resources. You can sign up for the city's newsletter to find out more about our upcoming webinar. You can also sign up for the Food for Thought newsletter if you scroll back up a little bit. Thank you again to Dorota, Christian, and Florian for some really interesting and informative and a lot of work that we need to do. We learned in those presentations. So thank you again. Have a great rest of your afternoon, and you can again find this webinar recorded on YouTube to share with colleagues if they missed. So thank you again.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.